Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with leading scholars in the field. And with me today is Laurie Brand of the University of Southern California and a member of the POMEPS Steering Committee. Welcome to GW, Laurie.
Thanks, Marc. It's great to be here.
So you have a new book out. It is actually this book, Official Stories, Politics and National Narratives in Egypt and Algeria. And it's hot off the presses. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and what it's about and what you were trying to do?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you know, obviously I'm a political scientist or I wouldn't be here, but I've always been very interested in the word, in language. I've studied a number of languages over the years. And as part of some earlier research that I was doing on, actually for my previous book on states and expatriates, I became very interested in the way that official documents referred to these communities of workers abroad. So I was looking at the cases of Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, and Lebanon, and over time, the way that the states tended to refer to them seemed to change. Also, there were differences in the way that the states referred to them. So I became interested in this notion of how the migrants fit into a national story. So originally, when I started a new project, I was thinking that I might work on something like that. But as time passed and as I was gathering documents and reading some more about narratives, I felt that I wanted to broaden the project a bit. So I began to look in terms of a broader understanding of a narrative, broader themes that might be covered. I wanted to do a set of comparative cases, which is the way that I've historically gone about my research. And initially, I chose 4. I ended up carrying out only 3, but only 2 made it into the book because I think this is the first time I've done a project that deals.
Who was the unlucky country?
Jordan was the unlucky country, actually.
As always.
As always, yes. No, there was just too much information, perhaps because this book is done a little bit differently from my previous works in that it didn't involve extensive field work, the kind of interviewing and participant observation that I've done for my previous works. This is largely work of textual analysis. I look extensively at a series of textbooks over the years, history textbooks, religion textbooks, social science textbooks, in an attempt to chart or discern what the national narrative is, and then look at it against the background of developments in these countries.
Now, how did you get hold of those textbooks?
That's, yes, well, in very different ways depending on which case country we're talking about. In the case of Algeria, there was no central repository of these textbooks, and so I was forced to, actually at the encouragement and with the advice of some people associated with the center in Oran, which is part of the Ames group of centers, to go to some local high schools, some of the old high schools, and just look in their libraries and see if there were textbooks there. And that in itself is a very long story. I tried to do that, and I thought I had some success, and then I was stopped by the principal of the first school that I went to, and I was told that unless I had an official letter that I couldn't get in. Anyway, I ultimately, with the help of some people at the archives in Oran, and then also with the continued assistance of the people in Sema in Oran, was able to get access to a number of local high schools and just got together as many textbooks as I could. That was the Algeria story. In the case of Egypt, I was helped out by a couple of colleagues who enabled me to get access to what is, in effect, it's a museum that's part of the Ministry of Education, and in a back room there is a wonderful set of old textbooks going back to the early part of the 20th century. And so I was able to gain access to that and just digitally photograph thousands of pages of documents. In Jordan, there's actually a textbook museum. And it was, in fact, your colleague, Nathan Brown, who alerted me to the fact that at this museum, which had been closed, it seems it had to do with an interministerial battle, it had been closed but had been just reopened. And so I was able to get the textbooks there.
So what are the key things that you found then by comparing Egypt and Algeria and Jordan, even though it wasn't big enough for the book?
It wasn't big enough for the book. What I was trying to do was understand, I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done on national narratives. I focused on 3 strands in a narrative because narratives have many different elements to them. One was what has been referred to as the founding story or the founding myth. The second is the notions of national identity, and the other is constructions of national unity. Okay. And I tried then through the various texts that I was looking at to chart the evolution of the constitution or the scripting of those terms or histories over time. Some of the work that's been done on narratives suggests that the possibilities for introducing changes into narratives or rescripting them, is most likely to occur, or the possibilities are most likely to occur, when there's some sort of a major crisis. That provides a kind of opening, a discursive opening, if you will, for changes in these kinds of constructions. So I tried, in the case of all three countries, to at the beginning sort of pinpoint what I thought would be key crises that would be worth examining against the sort of the backdrop of these changes. And so just to sort of sum up a little bit, I categorize these changes, these critical junctures, if you will, into changes or crises associated with changes in leadership, with wars, and then with internal insurgencies. And I guess if there's a takeaway line, it is that it's not so much the nature, the particular nature of the crisis, that is, whether it's a change in leadership or a war or an internal insurgency, but instead it has to do with the nature of the governing coalition at a given time, the degree to which there's already pre-existing factionalism, either at the leadership level or also from below. And so when we have significant factionalism at work, at a time when there is one of these crises, those are the junctures at which we see much more significant changes introduced into the way the national story is presented, the way that the parameters of national identity are presented, or the boundaries of unity are presented.
Because they're fighting over it.
In effect, they're fighting it. Yes, that seems to be what it is. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting, one of the things I would have expected, would have been that after a war, particularly, I mean, in the case of in these two cases, I have three wars. They're all in the Egyptian case. We have Suez, we have the 73 war, and then we have the 1967 war. I would have thought in the wake of major wars that there might also be some sort of rescripting. But in fact, in the case of 56 and 73, I think primarily because Egypt was able, because these were political victories, even though they were military defeats, that the leaderships in place at the time were able to use them as a way of further consolidating leadership as opposed to its having been a damaging incident or a threat. 67, it may be because Nasser died too soon after 67. It was a little bit, there wasn't enough time to fully judge. It's entirely possible, given the directions in which Nasser was moving after 1967, that we might have seen some rescripting of the narrative in a relatively slow or incremental way, but he died in 1970 and then we get Sadat, so we didn't really have a chance to gauge that.
In some ways, Algeria seems a fascinating case for this, between the War of Liberation and then the insurgencies and the breakdown of the 1990s. Do they deal with this at all in the textbooks? How do they talk about? Well,
the revolution, 1954 to 62, is the founding story for Algeria.
Yeah.
And there are references to the Algerian state under Abdel Qadir, but this really is, and of course the 1952 revolution in the Egyptian case is also the kind of the new founding story. It's not that they don't make reference to Muhammad Ali or to sort of subsequent revolutions like Orabi or 1919.
Pharaohs, they go back that far?
Well, there is certainly an appeal to the fact that we are a civilization of 7,000 years. But in terms of a real founding story, in Egypt it's 52, in Algeria it's 54 to 62. But I think there is a qualitative difference between the Egyptian and Algerian cases, and that is that in Algeria, because of the length of the war, and also because of the length of the settler colonial regime that preceded it, we're really talking about something which was devastating internally. And so it takes on almost mythic proportions, almost sacred proportions in the Algerian case. And so the ability to introduce changes is, I think, more problematic in the Algerian case. The degree to which, therefore, it's instrumentalized or mobilized is also a little bit different in the Algerian case. But yes, it's central, making appeal to the revolution, being able to claim that you fought in the revolution have been extremely important in terms of legitimacy formulas.
How do the textbooks deal with the 90s?
They don't.
They don't.
They don't. I mean, I think that's one of the very interesting things. And I looked at textbooks not only of these three countries as I was doing the project, but I also encountered some textbooks from other countries as well. Coverage of modern history tends to be much, much less. One of the interesting things, however, in the Algerian textbooks over time was that there's gradually more and more attention devoted to Algeria. You end up having textbooks introduced which focus specifically on Algeria, and in the Jordanian case too, you have a textbook devoted specifically to, history devoted specifically to Jordan. So there begins to be, I don't know whether one wants to see this as part of a further sort of stateness or developing of stateness in the region, but there is greater attention devoted to specifically Algerian history as opposed to broader Maghrebi history or even broader sort of MENA history going forward.
And in the case of Jordan, then, I mean, your work in the past on Jordanian-Palestinian relations and the identity politics there, I mean, this seems like an obvious space for narrative construction and identity shaping. even though you didn't write about it, I mean, what did you see as you were looking through this in terms of how these questions of national identity were being posed?
Well, one of the interesting things in Jordan is that, of course, you have a leadership which is not from the territory.
Right.
And so the question is, then how do you, what do you appeal to as a founding story? The Great Arab Revolt, which begins in the way that it's addressed initially in early texts as simply the Arab Revolt. It doesn't take on the qualifier great until we get much farther into Jordan's history. So really it's after the events of 1956-57. So as one starts looking at textbooks that are being produced in 58, 59, 60, that the kind of the lionization of the Great Arab Revolt really is, it becomes manifest. And there is therefore the number of pages in these textbooks that are devoted to the Great Arab Revolt increases over time. The kind of the fleshing out of what the Great Arab Revolt was about. I mean, it's transformed from being, an important military campaign, and that of course is also debatable, but during the First World War, to a program with social, political, cultural, and so on aspects to it. So it really is. It takes on much greater proportions as time goes on, but it's also, as is true with a lot of these founding stories, there are flexible elements in it which allow it to be interpreted and reinterpreted over time. So for example, in case of the book that you did on Jordan specifically, where you were looking at, I mean, one of the centerpieces of your work was the disengagement, right?
Right,
okay.
1988.
So how does a regime which has a dynasty, a royal ruling family, that has built its reputation on Arabness and trying to continue to expand its realm and being a home for all Arabs, how do you deal with a decision which basically ends up cutting off a portion of the homeland, right?
So how do they do it?
How do they do it? Well, King Hussein, it's amazing the sort of verbal gymnastics that he was able to undertake. But he argued that because there had been a growing feeling among the Palestinians and the Arabs that Palestinians wanted a separate form of expression, that Jordan, because it was part of an Arab consensus, would of course go along with this, and so that because it was going along with an Arab consensus, that therefore was in keeping with Jordan's long-standing commitment to Arab causes, and therefore it also fit into the narrative of the Great Arab Revolt, which was in the service of the Arab cause.
So do post-1988 textbooks refer to Palestine or West Bank as part of Jordan, or not?
No, there tends to be very little discussion of those kinds of things. The very earliest textbooks refer to what became the State of Israel after 1948 as kind of this somewhere between being Palestine and Jordan. So it's very interesting the way the early textbooks finesse it. But then as time goes on, there is a reference then just sort of, East Bank and West Bank. But then, again, modern history tends to get much less play than older periods.
Well, that is really interesting. So if you find this interesting, be sure to read Official Stories, Politics and National Narratives in Egypt and Algeria. Laurie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Marc. It's been great.